There was a time when Matt Lauer was one of the safest faces on television. Millions of people woke up to him every morning. He interviewed presidents, movie stars, athletes, and world leaders. He was trusted enough to sit in America's living rooms before most families had even finished breakfast. Then, in November 2017, everything changed. NBC News announced that Lauer had been fired after receiving a complaint about alleged inappropriate sexual behavior in the workplace. The network said it had reason to believe the complaint was not an isolated incident. Lauer later apologized for some of his behavior but disputed parts of the allegations. And just like that, one of the biggest careers in television was over. But the shocking part wasn't only that Lauer lost his job. It was how quickly the world around him disappeared. The morning show that had helped make him famous was suddenly talking about him without him sitting at the desk. Colleagues who had worked beside him for years were forced to confront allegations about someone they thought they knew. And viewers who had invited Lauer into their homes for decades were left asking the same question. How could someone so successful fall so far, so fast? What followed was bigger than one television job. More allegations became public. NBC faced intense questions about what it knew and when it knew it. Lauer's marriage eventually ended in divorce. His once highly visible public life became remarkably private. But there is another question hiding underneath all of this. What happens to a person when the career that defined them suddenly disappears? Because Lauer didn't simply lose a job. He lost the platform that had made him a household name. And the life he built after leaving television looks very different from the one viewers remember. So before we look at where Matt Lauer is today, we need to go back to the beginning, before the fame, before the scandal, and before the name became impossible to separate from controversy. Because the man who eventually became one of America's most recognizable TV hosts was once just another young journalist trying to get his first real break. Long before Matt Lauer became the face of a national morning show, he was simply trying to find a place in television. Lauer was born in New York City in 1957 and began his broadcasting career in the late 1970s. He worked his way through local television, taking jobs in places that were far less glamorous than the world he would eventually enter. There was no instant path to fame. He had to build it. Lauer moved through local news and talk shows before eventually getting opportunities with larger networks. His early career was a lesson in persistence. He was not born into television royalty. He spent years learning how to interview people, handle live broadcasts, and stay calm when things went wrong. Those skills would later become part of his greatest strength. By the 1990s, Lauer had become a familiar television personality. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. In 1994, he joined NBC's Today as a news anchor and substitute host. A few years later, he became the show's main co-anchor alongside Katie Couric. Suddenly, Lauer was no longer just another television journalist. He was part of America's morning routine. Every weekday, viewers watched him interview celebrities, politicians, athletes, and ordinary people with extraordinary stories. His calm style made him seem comfortable in almost any situation. And NBC rewarded that success. Lauer became one of the network's biggest stars, eventually signing enormous contracts that reflected his value to the company. His career reached a level most journalists could only dream about. But success can create its own trap. The more famous Lauer became, the more powerful his position became inside the television world. And that is important when looking back at what happened later. Because the allegations that eventually destroyed his career were not about a struggling reporter trying to get noticed. They involved a man who had reached the very top. In November 2017, NBC announced his firing after a complaint about alleged inappropriate sexual behavior. Additional allegations soon followed, and the story became part of the much larger reckoning that was taking place across the entertainment and media industries. The image of the trusted morning host was collapsing in real time, and the public was about to see just how quickly decades of success could disappear. But that wasn't the real surprise. The next chapter would reveal how much the scandal affected not only Lauer's career, but the people and institutions around him. And once NBC closed the door behind him, there was no easy way back. For more than 2 decades, Matt Lauer had built his life around one thing: being on television. Then, in less than 24 hours, that life was gone. On November 29, 2017, NBC announced that Lauer had been fired from Today after the network received a complaint about alleged inappropriate sexual behavior in the workplace. NBC said the complaint gave them reason to believe the incident was not isolated. The announcement shocked viewers because Lauer had appeared on the program just one day earlier. There was no long goodbye. No final interview. No chance to slowly step away. The chair was simply empty. And then the allegations began to grow. Reporting by the New York Times and Variety brought additional accounts from women who described alleged sexual misconduct by Lauer. The reports turned what had first appeared to be one workplace complaint into a much larger story. Lauer denied some of the allegations while acknowledging behavior he said was inappropriate. The reaction was enormous. NBC was suddenly forced to answer difficult questions about how a powerful employee had operated inside the company for years. His colleagues were also placed in an uncomfortable position, as people tried to understand what they had seen, what they had missed, and what they had never known. And the timing mattered. The scandal came during a period when powerful men across media and entertainment were facing public accusations of sexual misconduct. The culture around these stories had changed. Allegations that might once have remained private were now being investigated and reported in public. Lauer's career became one of the most dramatic examples. Within days, his professional world had collapsed. But the consequences did not stop at NBC. His marriage to Annette Roque, whom he had married in 1998, eventually ended. His relationship with NBC was over. His public image was permanently changed. And the man who had spent years speaking to millions of people suddenly had very little to say publicly. If you're enjoying documentaries that go beyond the headlines, subscribe now, because the biggest part of Lauer's story wasn't what happened when he lost his job. It was what happened after the cameras stopped. Because once the attention faded, Lauer had to build a life without the career that had defined him for decades. And that life would look almost nothing like the one viewers remembered. Once the cameras disappeared, Matt Lauer's life became almost unrecognizable. For years, his schedule had been built around television. Early mornings, interviews, travel, meetings, live broadcasts, millions of people watching. Now, there was none of that. After leaving NBC, Lauer largely withdrew from public life. Reports have described him living a quiet life in the Hamptons, spending time with his children and keeping a much smaller social circle than he had during his television years. But disappearing from television did not mean disappearing from the headlines. His personal life was changing too. Lauer and Annette Roque had been married for more than 20 years. They had 3 children together. After separating following the 2017 scandal, their divorce was finalized in September 2019. For someone who had spent decades being watched by the public, this new life was almost the opposite. Privacy became valuable. And there was another major change. Lauer began a relationship with Shaman Abbas, a public relations executive, in the years after his divorce. The two have been reported together for several years, although they have generally kept their relationship away from the spotlight. Still, the idea that Lauer had completely walked away from media was not always true. In 2024, Us Weekly reported that people close to him believed he was interested in returning to the media world. The report described him as exploring what a possible next act might look like. But there was a major problem. What network would want him? And what audience would welcome him back? That question has followed Lauer ever since. He had money. He had experience. He had contacts. He knew television better than almost anyone. But fame does not work the same way after a scandal. A person can lose a job and find another one. Lauer had lost something much harder to replace: public trust. And that may explain why, despite reports of comeback plans, he has remained largely absent from mainstream television. More recent reports describe him as living quietly and focusing on family and private life rather than holding a major media job. Have you ever watched someone lose the career they spent their whole life building? What would you do if your entire professional identity suddenly disappeared? Share your thoughts below. Because Lauer's story raises an uncomfortable question. Maybe the hardest part wasn't losing the spotlight. Maybe it was discovering that the spotlight could move on without you. And just when it seemed his television career was permanently finished, reports began appearing that he might not be ready to disappear forever. Type next to continue. For years, the story seemed finished. Matt Lauer was gone from television. He had left NBC. His marriage had ended, and he had built a much quieter life away from the cameras. But then, nearly 8 years after his firing, his name began appearing in headlines again. In late 2025, people reported that Lauer was considering a return to the media world. The important detail was that this did not necessarily mean a return to traditional television. According to a source, he had spoken with people about getting back into media in some form. That sounds simple, but it is anything but. Because there is a huge difference between wanting to return and actually being given a platform. Lauer still has decades of experience. He knows how to conduct interviews. He knows television production. He understands news audiences better than most people ever will. But the industry has changed, and so has the public. Reports in 2025 suggested that some insiders believed a traditional television comeback was extremely unlikely. Page 6 also reported that rumors of Lauer returning had surfaced repeatedly over the years without producing a concrete comeback. Those reports relied heavily on anonymous industry sources, so they should be treated as reporting rather than proof of a permanent ban. That distinction matters, because the headline says, "He will never work again." The reality is more complicated. There is no known rule saying Lauer can never work in media again. But there is also no major television network publicly announcing that it wants him back. And that gap tells the real story. Lauer does not appear to need a job financially. Recent reporting says he has continued living a private life in the Hamptons, spending time with his children and maintaining a relationship with Shaman Abbas. So why return? Maybe it is about work. Maybe it is about identity. Or maybe, after spending most of his adult life being heard by millions of people, silence simply became difficult to accept. And that makes his possible comeback more than a television story. It becomes a question about whether someone can rebuild a public career after losing the trust that made that career possible. But while the industry debates whether Matt Lauer could return, something else has happened. The public has moved on. And the man